This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavion Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood, in the heart of my hometown of Beit Shemesh. It's actually just minutes away from where I live. This puts you in a convenient and central location that has easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, but is also surrounded by trees and parks and overlooks the Elah Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings, but this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbi and rebbitzin. I'm pleased to announce that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be leading the spiritual development of this project as they make aliyah to Eden with their 4 children and create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I was very excited when I heard that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Krohn were going to be part of this project. My family and the Krohns go back decades, and the Krohn family are genuinely among the finest people I've ever met in my life. The fact that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Krohn will be part of the Eden Project ensures that this development will be special indeed. For more information, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. That's info@edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast.
I do believe that we have a responsibility. And I remember and Scott knows my son, when my son enlisted in the IDF in Machal, and he was in Kfir, which is a combat unit. They said, "Are you going to let him go into a combat unit?" And I said, "How am I able to go to Israel and look at my friends in Israel who have to send their kids into combat units and say, no, I wouldn't let my own son do that." So there is this responsibility that if we believe that this is the Jewish state and that this is critical to our identity, then we need to take responsibility for it.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Do Jews outside of Israel care enough about Israel? This is a loaded and perhaps unfair question. How could anyone make that determination? Nevertheless, it's something I've been grappling with for some time, and I decided to pose this question on the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group on Facebook. Many people commented, both on the group and in private communications. I'm going to read 2 of the private comments now, the first from someone in Israel, and the second from a mother in the United States who has kids serving in the Israeli army. After that, I'll read a third representative comment that was posted publicly on the group. Here's the first comment. I think it's important to note that while American Jewry have been very helpful with generously contributing to Israel, soldiers, etc., they have also somewhat checkmarked their involvement by doing so, enabling them to go on with their lives as such. We in Israel don't get to do this for a moment. This obviously does not include those who can make the effort to get on a plane and be physically involved here or show support in another way. It's important for me to recognize the help that Americans have given us here, but it's not their lives, and Israel is really very far removed for many. As I've mentioned before, a stranger will not really understand what we're going through. Therefore, we, as Israelis, may never feel the quality of help we may like, due to the fact that this is such a long and ongoing situation for us. There are so many different ways to reach out and show we care. One such beautiful and touching project was done in Halb School, where the kids were shown a picture of a soldier each day and davened for him or her. The soldier's family was then notified about it the next day. The soldiers and their families obviously found this gesture very moving, as it was complete strangers who took the time to learn about them and daven for their safety. I think my difficulty with the question you posed stems from what does care enough mean? Where do you draw the line? How involved do we expect people who aren't part of us to be? Or are they part of us? If so, they need to show it in ways in addition to Zelle or PayPal. Now here's the second response from someone living in the United States whose kids are in the IDF. From what I see here, there is a minority of Jews that care and demonstrate and send money, and I think it's mainly the modern Orthodox conservative. I think everybody else just really don't care. For example, my shul at the end of davening, they say some kind of made-up prayer for the IDF. It's not the regular one. The hostages are not mentioned in any of the newsletters. The soldiers of the community, Everyone has nieces or nephews or cousins in the army. They are not mentioned. Yes, it is a more yeshivish shul, but where I live, this is the norm rather than the exception. They'll say they care, but what do they do to show that they care? How many of them have gotten on a plane and gone to volunteer with any of the volunteer organizations? They pay lip service. They'll all say that they care, but they can do so much more for Israel and for the people of Israel, and they don't. Here's a third comment, also from someone who lives outside of Israel, in response to someone who suggested that there's a big gap in the caring department when it comes to Israelis and those in the United States. You want people in Chutz La'aretz to stop vacations, or else they don't care about Israel? There isn't a day that goes by without me thinking about Israel or desiring to support Israel. All the local synagogues, including Haredi ones, have been saying daily Tehillim. Large support has been shown to Army members in the area and or families of Army members. When the war broke out, individuals were asking around to raise funds to help donate to the family members of those who were fighting. Many of us, including myself, voted in our American ballots with Israel as an issue deeply on our minds when we decided for whom to vote. I think you're painting too broad of a brush to say that Orthodox Jews in America don't care. And if nothing short of army service counts as caring for you, then by definition, every Jew who is in America and not fighting in Israel doesn't care, which is absurd. So in short, while the question was phrased somewhat provocatively, there's still a lot that's worth discussing. This is obviously an issue that people think about, and people land on both sides of the issue. For that reason, I was honored to host Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, Dr. Logan Levkoff, and Shira Katz Shaulov to discuss, openly and frankly, whether Jews outside of Israel are doing all that they should to support Israel, and by extension, whether Jews in Israel are doing what they should for Jews outside of Israel. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz is the senior rabbi of Congregation Kilat Yeshurun on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He has been a congregational rabbi for over 30 years and previously served pulpits in Montreal, Quebec, and Mount Vernon, New York. He has always been deeply engaged in community affairs and sits on multiple organizational boards. He is a founding board member of the Moral Hearts Alliance, which builds Jewish-Christian cooperation in support of Israel. He writes a weekly column for the Jewish Journal and has written for many other publications, including The Washington Post, The Daily News, The Globe and Mail, La Presse, Haaretz, and The Jerusalem Post. In October, Rabbi Steinmetz published his first book, Despite Everything, a chronicle of Jewish resilience in the aftermath of October 7th. Rabbi Steinmetz is married to Lisa Schwartz, and they have 4 children. Dr. Logan Levkoff specializes in uncomfortable conversations. An internationally recognized expert on sexuality and relationships, she encourages honest conversation about sexuality and the role it plays in our culture. However, in the past few years, Logan has become a sought-after voice in the Jewish and Zionist influencer space, using her platform to combat anti-Semitism and foster unapologetic Jewish pride. Logan's work has been recognized by Jewish Women International. She was a 2018 Woman to Watch. She is a member of the first cohort of the Tel Aviv Institute's Jews Talk Justice Lab, and was named one of the top 50 pro-Israel influencers in 2021. Logan is the chairperson of the Caravan for Democracy Student Leadership Mission to Israel, a program for non-Jewish student leaders on college campuses run through the Jewish National Fund, and she serves on the JNF New York City board and is the regional chair of Israel Advocacy and Education. She's also a founding member of the #IBelieveIsraeliWomen movement. Logan received her PhD in human sexuality, marriage, and family life education from New York University, and an MS in Human Sexuality Education and a BA in English from the University of Pennsylvania. She lives in New York City with her husband, son, and daughter. Shira Katz Shaulov was born in South Africa and grew up in Israel and the United States. She made Aliyah on her own right after high school and has lived in Beit Shemesh for the past 24 years. Shira is the mother of 4 boys, some of whom have been involved in fighting in the war in Gaza and Lebanon. She works as an interior designer and a remedial math teacher for all levels, and since October 8th of last year, has been very involved in helping soldiers in various units with gear, food, and anything else they need. This includes fundraising, purchasing, and delivering the goods down to Gaza. Dr. Logan Levkoff, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, and Shira Katz Shaulov, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast. A couple of words of introduction, which are essentially caveats before we begin what might be considered somewhat controversial or a controversial conversation. First, I'm not pretending that a conversation among four people about this topic will resolve whether American Jews in particular and Jews outside of Israel in general are doing enough on behalf of Israel. That is a subjective standard, and there's no way to actually measure it in any meaningful way. What I would like to hear are impressions in order to talk about expectations and reality, so that other people, both in and outside of Israel, will consider this question for themselves and talk about it with other Jews who care. And my second caveat is this, which is that nothing I say should be construed as directed at any specific individuals, and I'm sure this is true also for my guests. I know there are many people who care deeply about Israel and do whatever they can for Israel, and if someone makes a sweeping statement along the lines of, for example, American Jews should do more, listeners should be well aware that this is meant as a general statement and does not imply that all individuals without exception are not doing enough. And it also, of course, remains nothing more than a subjective impression. Those are my caveats, and I hope that that will just set the tone for this conversation to be a respectful but honest conversation. And one more thing, just the genesis of this conversation really was a Substack article I wrote on December 24th entitled A Way to Show You Care, with the secondary title of The United Nations Demonstrates That It Hates Israel. Now it's our turn to demonstrate in front of the UN in unprecedented numbers. I wrote to several people to ask them what they thought about having a massive demonstration in front of the UN, preferably the day before Trump's inauguration on Sunday, the 19th of January. And Rabbi Steinmetz, who's here with us today, kindly replied to me. I'm going to read, Rabbi Steinmetz, what you wrote to me at the time, because I think it's very telling. He wrote, I read the piece. My experience is people show up to rallies because of events, such as when the war started or after Hirsch was murdered. They show up because they are driven by anger and passion. Even anniversaries don't always fly, like trying to do it on November 29th. An anniversary like October 7th would work, and I am still astonished that the national federations did not do a mega rally on that day. Then they tried to do a mega rally on the one-year anniversary of the first rally, and that flopped completely. The other possibility is a significant ask, the need to release Soviet Jewry, which had an acute problem of refuseniks in the Gulag and visa denials, and an ongoing ask of pushing the U.S. government was able to do one rally a year on Solidarity Sunday. I just don't think you will get tens of thousands for this cause, which is simply not the same. I would come and push my shul, but you would end up with about 1,000 people. I was asking for this to be the biggest rally of all time. That's the context in which Rabbi Steinmetz wrote that very interesting reply. He concluded by saying, again, the best rallies are driven by passion, which is a roundabout way of saying that they are driven by immediate events. Now I'm just going to read my response to him, and then we'll get into our conversation, because I really want to hear from our guests and not from myself. I wrote to Rabbi Steinmetz saying, I really appreciate your honest and forthright response. Perhaps this is not for me to say, but the fact that Palestinian rallies in European capitals get tens of thousands of participants on a regular basis, whereas you suspect, and I think you may be right, that the Jewish community can't do the same for Israel absent an immediate threat, is somewhat of an indictment. I know that Jews in Israel need a show of support, both for ourselves and in order to demonstrate to Israelis that the gap between Israeli Jews and their American counterparts is not as wide as many now suspect. The grand gesture, as I called it, is the only way that Israelis will get that message. A rally with a couple of thousand people, if anything, shows the opposite. Please let me know if you disagree. This Shabbat, we in Ramat Beit Shemesh were awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning because of a ballistic missile fired by the Houthis, and then had Mincha interrupted as 2 rockets were fired from Gaza shortly after 4 p.m. Sirens in the middle of the night, sadly, are becoming more, not less, common. Meanwhile, our kids continue to fight in Gaza, with 100 hostages still imprisoned there. The war obviously is not yet over. I know that I'm preaching to the choir, but it seems sad to me that the Jewish community, which emotionally feels that it is 100% in Israel's corner, doesn't realize that people here need a show of support that they can see. Tehillim after davening is important, but it's not enough. But if it won't work, there's nothing we can do, and it's easy for me to talk about it from this side when the work would likely fall on others. That was my response to Rabbi Steinmetz. And I think this encapsulates the problem, which is that in some ways, I think a lot of American Jews and Israeli Jews are talking past each other. And I wonder what the three of you, my three guests today, think about this particular issue. Rabbi Steinmetz, since I read your email, why don't we start with you? What's your feeling?
Okay, so I want to really go to, back to that article, because your article was asking for a mega rally. But what I thought you were doing was actually you were, as they call it in the newspaper business, burying the lead. The real point that has to be made, and something that I started to think about after we had this back and forth, is you weren't really asking for a rally. You were asking for us to recognize that Israeli Jews feel abandoned by American Jews. And that's something I have to tell you I have not heard before, which is why I'm very curious actually to hear what both of you and Shira, have to say about this, because I've spent a fair amount of time in Israel. We've had Israelis in synagogue speaking every single week, and no one said we don't feel like the American Jews are in our corner. If anything, on the contrary, we hear the opposite. And if that really is a perception, and I wonder also, like, if you could define who you are. In other words, would an Israeli born who lives in Tel Aviv, someone who's born in Israel who lives in Tel Aviv, a native Israeli, have the same feelings? Is this a sort of an Anglo-Israeli feeling? Like these are some things I'm very, very curious about. But like I said, to me, you were burying the lead. The real article that has to be written, which I have not seen anywhere else, are Israelis saying, American Jews, are you with us? I've never heard that before. And I'm actually very curious to hear about more about it right now.
Okay, I want to give it over to Logan and Shira in just a moment. But just to answer one thing, I think, Rabbi Steinmetz, what you're saying is true in the sense that I bury the lead, but I wouldn't call it a binary. I don't think Israelis think that American Jews have abandoned Israeli Jews. I think, however, they say they could do more, or they care deeply emotionally, but it's not necessarily translated into action. So I wouldn't use the word abandoned, but I would use the word, are they really with us to the degree they were 14 months ago in terms of action, advocacy, rallies, coming to Israel, donating? Logan, what's your take on this?
In the spirit of full disclosure, I just got back from my 8th trip to Israel in the last 12 months. So I am one of those American Jews who feels compelled to be in Israel at this particular moment. And I was there during the April Iran drone attack. I was there during Sirens this week and on October 7th, 2 months ago. So I try and practice what I preach, not just, I want people to know that I do the work. I agree with you, Rabbi Steinmetz, that I have not heard Israelis say that we haven't done enough, but I do think that Americans, and again, general statement, unwillingness to be in Israel right now, despite the fact that you can't get a flight, thank you, El Al, is problematic, right? Because it seems like over the last decade plus, we have started to believe here that Israel needed us more than we needed her, only to wake up on October 7th and realize that we were so completely wrong. But in addition to just, showing up to rallies and giving money and support, I do think we need to be there. We need to find ways to be there to stand side by side and say, we are with you. We are taking risks with you. We are one family. And I wish that more people would be doing that.
Okay, thank you, Logan. Shira, perhaps you can also respond to what Rabbi Steinmetz said before.
Okay. Firstly, I've been involved in helping soldiers from different units for the past year plus, since really October 8th, from the beginning of the war. Since I've lived in Israel for most of the time, I think that, Rabbi Steinmetz, I can answer your question, how Israelis view the appreciation from American help. And I think that they do appreciate the funding, they appreciate the goods, they appreciate the things that are donated. They see some of the people coming to help and volunteer. Nonetheless, when you're not here, you don't really experience the real hardships of what's going on. Not talking about only the getting up once in a while, in the middle of the night for a siren, but it's really as a family, a parent, a spouse who's really going through the difficulty for months and months on end. Scott, you can really understand that, as a parent of a soldier and what that really entails. The amount of funding that has come forth from U.S. Jews is phenomenal, and that's wonderful. But it takes, I think, more than money to have that support. To support isn't that all that difficult. To pick up the phone to people who you know, to people who sometimes you may not really know, and to show and to say, you know what? How are you actually really doing? How are you really feeling on a day-to-day basis? Come and send something, whether it's a bunch of flowers or a letter, an email, or something here or there, to actually say, you know what, we care. We're not talking about, honestly, the support in the masses. The support can be on a small scale. It can be on a large scale. It doesn't have to be hosting people, in hotels and giving people, all that support. It can be on a much lower scale, and those things that were done in the first few weeks of the war, I can tell you, spoke to people's hearts, and that's what mattered. But then that kind of just fizzled out, and okay, so we've been there and done that. And I can tell you, I've personally received those responses from various communities in the U.S. when I myself came to speak as a mother who has been involved in doing a lot of work with the soldiers. And I was basically told, you know what, we don't really feel like hearing you because we've done that already, or we don't really feel like hearing it anymore because we've had enough. And I couldn't respond. I was absolutely flabbergasted at a point like that. When what can I say? What can I say to somebody like that? And there's just no answer.
Okay, Rabbi Steinmetz, can you talk a little bit more about your experience, which is quite different from the experience described by Shira?
Right. No, so I do want to actually double back to what Shira says, and it's something that I do try to communicate to our community. And Shira is correct, and this is just the way people are, and it's not unique to America. It's true in Israel. Like, people are not necessarily taking their call up to Miluim anymore. Like, they're sort of deferring them and pushing them off, while 15 months ago they were running and coming from India and coming from the US and coming from everywhere. And now people are like, I can't do any more Miluim. I've done 250 days. I can't. And in the United States, it's the same thing. And what I do try to tell my community, and this is my perhaps one worry I have, is that the people don't understand the extent of the challenges that Israel faces and how much pain there is, whether it be obviously for people who've lost someone, or people who are injured, or marriages that have been shattered, or businesses that have gone under. And people don't understand the magnitude of it. And when I get up and I make an appeal for money, and the appeals for money are not as effective now, I see it myself. I try to remind people that all you're doing is giving money. And in Israel, to keep the Jewish state alive, people are giving a lot more than that. And so I do try to show that lack of balance. But I do want to, and by the way, just also say that Shira is correct. I mean, I won't even say the city. It's a city in New Jersey where, I was talking to a rabbi, and I said, we have, every week we've had speakers that relate to Israel, and a week from Shabbos we have another one, but almost every week we had speakers from Israel. And the other rabbi said, here they feel like it's enough, like they've heard enough, like it's done. So I do know that that's part of it also. And people do want to hear something more positive, and maybe that's also part of it, is that there's only so much pain you can absorb, and maybe in Israel there's the same phenomenon. There's we can't talk about the sadness over and over again because we need to live. And that's really what I want to sort of talk about with what Shira was saying. It is a normal phenomenon that people will just sort of, their enthusiasm will lag. They don't, and we've also trained people I'm sorry to give so many different points. We've also trained people more or less since 1973 that every conflict is short, right? It's 2 months, 3 months. We go, right, yeah, and then it's over. And now we have a lengthy conflict. It's 15 months. Everyone feels like it might be over soon, but it might not be over soon. It might not be over soon because there may be another round with Iran, and we don't know what will happen after that. And I think we haven't been trained for this. This is human nature, that enthusiasm wanes. And those of us who are trying to keep that enthusiasm going are doing our best. But what I will say on the flip side is I can't imagine that the same thing isn't happening in Israel. Again, back to my main question is, do Israelis feel like you do, Scott? That and is this a subset of Israelis? In other words, are these the Israelis who know America and say, "Come on, you guys, you're my people"? Because there are many Israelis like Shai Davidai. I'm sorry to one more point. Shai Davidai, when you ask him, he'll tell you that when he organized a rally on October 8th in response to the war, he organized a rally, what he thought in his mind was a rally of Israelis, because he never imagined American Jews would even be interested. And when American Jews showed up, he was blown away. And he's become now part of the American Jewish community. So I'm just wondering, is this a subset or is this a general feeling?
So by definition, my experience is a subset. I live in Ramat Beit Shemesh, which is about as American as you can get in Israel. I do have relatively Israeli kids. They're American Israeli kids, but they all were born here. And several of them go to places like Bar Ilan and live in Tel Aviv or Yerushalayim. They don't necessarily live in the same community that my wife Elisa and I do and our younger kids do. And in general, in talking with them, I get the feeling that they have the same experience, but I don't feel it so much as a type of disappointment as almost what I call yayus. Like, yeah, of course they don't get it at all. Americans don't understand one way or the other. That's the feeling I get in talking to people who are more Israeli than I am. Not so much that we're angry at Americans, but more, yeah, of course they don't get it. They're going on their regular vacations. There's also, of course, this Israeli attitude that all Americans are rich, which we know is not true. But that's sometimes the way a lot of Israelis might think. All Americans are rich. They're spoiled. It's one of these stereotypes that they have. So from what I've seen in the limited experience that I've had in talking to Israelis, I have a feeling that, at least in my experience, they would agree with me broadly, though the level of disappointment might not be there. It might be like, of course, what did you expect? Almost what you said about Shai Davidi, that's what he expected, and he was surprised by the support. So they who are saying, yeah, of course the support wanes, what would you expect when you're living in a nice community and you have other things going on and you don't have to deal with kids in the army? Logan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think all of this highlights the unfortunate situation that diaspora Jews have found themselves in, or we have put ourselves in over the years, which is this divide, or this perceived divide between Israel and the diaspora, as if we're not really one family, right? We're like, Israel is a point in our history, but we don't have a lot in common. And unfortunately, it's been one of the most frustrating things that my family has seen in the last few years. And I will tell you, I married a man who wasn't born Jewish, but has become Jewish and has lived in Israel with me over the last summers. Our 19, almost 20-year-old has spent every summer for the last 3 summers living in Israel. And the most frustrating thing to him, as someone who chose this and proudly is a Zionist, are all of the Jewish friends he has who have never once been to Israel, or maybe showed up when they became bar bat mitzvah, but have been on all of these trips all over the globe. It's not necessarily a financial issue, but it was a choice. And I think that it's that kind of disappointment that also highlights what's going on now. Because yes, I have been on incredible volunteer missions, and the same people show up and are passionate and are in it no matter what. But it's all the same other people who have sort of distanced themselves. And again, I don't necessarily think it's deliberate. I just think that diaspora Jews dropped the ball, right? We thought we had the luxury of assimilation, and with that perceived assimilation became this disconnect from our homeland, only to find out now we made a mistake, and now we're on our heels, right? We're trying to play catch up, and we're also, people are feeling so badly about what's happening that it's easier to turn it off than to manage those feelings of hardship. And we all have to do a better job here in the States at pushing ourselves beyond that. Yes, talking about resilience and empowerment, and the fact that we as Jews were made for this, for good and bad, but we were made for moments like this. We have survived despite the odds being stacked against us over and over again. But we have to teach people to deal with that discomfort. And we know that there are a lot of Americans who are not really great at dealing with those feelings of discomfort.
Logan, I'd like to ask you further about your 8 trips to Israel and the response that you've received, because the first time I really thought about this particular issue, it was actually the day that Chania was killed. Now Israel says it was them in Iran. It was that day I happened to be in Yerushalayim with Eliza. We were walking around and we were noticing on this summer day where usually Yerushalayim would be filled with tourists. There were Israelis around, but it felt pretty empty. It felt very much like, where is everybody? This is not the way it is in the summer. It felt like COVID summer. It was that sort of thing. There just weren't people around. And I started wondering, I said, what happened to all those solidarity trips? And it means several things. First of all, it means that Israelis feel, that's when we talk about, again, using Rabbi Steinmetz, your phrase, abandoned, maybe not that, but this idea of why are they going to the Bahamas or Europe, but they're not coming here? That certainly is part of it. But forget the emotional support. We can deal with that. But frankly, there are so many businesses that are just failing because they don't have enough money. Tourism has dried up. There are people who really could use it. It's not just a matter of showing that you're here. It's actually taking out a wallet and spending money in Israel, even if it has nothing to do with October 7th, going to restaurants, paying hotels, paying a tour guide. I have a good friend who's a tour guide. He's switching jobs. He has no business anymore. It's basically over for him. So I'm curious for you, Logan, what other Americans say when they see you going to Israel 8 times. Do they think, that's great, I should do that too, and I wish it costs less, and El Al, as you said, is somewhat to blame? Or do they say, you're crazy, what are you doing?
A little of everything, to be perfectly honest. My first trip was in December 2023. And I will say that I was on a volunteer mission, and then my in-laws, Catholic in-laws who had never been to Israel before, showed up on a trip that we had planned with my husband and my kids for the first time in Israel in December of 2023, right? Credit where credit is due. Amazing. And we were cooking with soldiers and for soldiers, and the man who was taking us around said, I was supposed to have 300 trips. My team was supposed to have 300 trips. You're the only family who showed up. Heartbreaking. A lot of people can't understand. I think they're impressed, but don't understand why I keep coming back. Not because they don't feel a sense of connection, but I think also because, and this is where let's blame the media, because I think there is a lot to blame there. The way in which they portray what is taking place in Israel is pretty abominable. And I've had people who have called in the last week, called me in Israel and said, I need to speak to you. I'm supposed to show up with my family next week, and everyone is really afraid. Now, I will tell you, I live in New York City. If you've read anything about what's happening in New York City these days, I am a hell of a lot more afraid to be on the New York City subway than I've ever been in Israel. And the one thing I would say for anyone who is listening, who's been either feeling like American Jews have abandoned them or anything else, when I first came to Israel to volunteer, and I've been on a few different volunteer missions. I've also just been living there as trying to be as much of a civilian as possible, and just being a tourist and supporting the economy and just being there. I was there with a group of non-Jewish student leaders on a trip that I chaired last week. So non-Jewish student leaders showed up last week, which is incredible. I got a lot of thank yous. I've gotten a lot of thank yous from Israelis. Thank you for being here. Thank you. And my answer or my reply is always the same thing. I don't really feel like I deserve it. And I don't, because I show up in Israel so that I can feel less alone too, because it feels lonely here. And so part of me being there is also our own Jewish self-preservation, because I want to be with my people. I want my feet on the ground with my history and my stories, and not to constantly feel like the other. So I feel like it's been a giant privilege to be in Israel during this time, despite the fact that there's so much tragedy. There is also a huge amount of meaning in reshaping our story. And it's been an honor to be able to just listen and observe and to feel like I get to be there.
Shira, would you like to add anything to that in terms of your feeling about Americans coming, or not just Americans, but anybody from Chutz La'aretz, Jews visiting Israel?
Yeah, thank you. So I actually have family literally in every continent. That's what happens with Lithuanian Jews who migrate to South Africa and then eventually just kind of travel the world. I have to say this situation is not unique to the US. US Jewry, I find, has actually been a lot more forthcoming, at least from what I've experienced, than any other group, which is really wonderful. Maybe again, it's that stigma of American Jews having more money. I don't know. I know that there is a law in England per se that you can't donate in certain things because it goes against the government. Every country has their own thing. But I do have to say, Logan, first of all, the fact that you've been here so many times is very heartwarming. Every time I see tourists traveling around, it really, really does put a huge smile on my face. And when I see people wanting to volunteer, it's a great source of pride because it's not something that used to be so. Volunteering didn't used to be on people's forefront and really has become now, and showing that solidarity really is a really very big deal. I can say today when we have vacation with the kids, one of the key activities that we do is to go and volunteer when it's not something that we ever used to do. It's reshaped our value system as well. One of the lessons that I can say that I've learned also throughout this entire period of time, not only in volunteering with the soldiers and parents and helping out with whatever type of group that they needed the help, was seeing that it's very hard for people to come out of their shell. I've noticed there are two types of people: those who are comfortable with themselves and those who are not. Those who are maybe not and are somewhat bordering would be able to take that extra step and be able to come and volunteer and to help and to speak to those who they never would have spoken to, be it people that they've never met, be it go to the hospitals and help and volunteer in very strange and uncomfortable situations. And then there are those who say, well, I'm too afraid and I really don't want to go because what if there's a siren, and I would rather sit on my couch and be afraid. And so I ended up being that mom who would travel down to Gaza numerous times every single week to be able to take carloads and carloads of goods that have been collected to be able to do that. Sometimes joined by other parents in the area and sometimes not. Same with speaking to people who have lost, unfortunately lost their kids, soldiers who've been killed in battle, and they don't have that support around them. Not everybody has that community. Not everyone has the ability to be able to go and to speak to everyone, and not everyone knows how to approach these people. So the story of being supportive is not only to the US, not only to other countries, it's really within ourselves as well. And it is something that I can feel that is a little bit less dwindling today. It's a situation that we're getting used to it. We are too comfortable with the uncomfortable situation, and we need to sometimes make ourselves a little bit more aware of things as well.
Shira, one thing which I said when I was in the New York area a few weeks ago, when I talked about my own personal lived experience as a father and father-in-law of a soldier and someone who just lives in Ramat Beit Shemesh and has regular sirens, which makes me very, very typical. It makes me no different from 9 million other Israelis. My experience hopefully is meaningful because it's so typical. And I talked about how life is and how it's hard to relate to it. And then I said afterwards that I'm being completely unfair. I said, by presenting that to Jews living in White Plains and Fair Lawn, New Jersey, that's not fair. That's like someone sitting Shiva saying, when someone comes to visit them, oh, you don't get it because you're not sitting Shiva. That's ridiculous. You're not supposed to sit Shiva, meaning it's not fair to expect people outside of Israel to have the same lived experience. If that's our standard, then I think we're being completely unfair to Jews who don't live in Israel. What may be a little bit different, though, is the activism aspect and saying, what can you do that you're not doing that would be possible for you to do in order to support people in Israel? And that's a loaded statement, because what could you be doing? We could all do I could do more. We could all do more. Part of it also for me on the emotional level is I think it's important for me just to acknowledge or to say that, even if American Jews care, sometimes, and maybe this is a selfish idea on my own, sometimes it's important for them simply to realize we can't understand what it's really like to have a soldier in the army who's your son, who's going into Lebanon on Yom Kippur, and you don't hear from him for 2 weeks. It's not that I'm asking for sympathy, but to realize that it's something which you can't relate to and you simply are in a different place, and to understand what we're going through in that sense. That's my own very private, very personal way of looking at it, not asking anyone to understand, but to recognize that divergence. I don't know if that speaks to you as well, Shira, in your experience.
Well, I think that what you're trying to say, Scott, is that you're expecting empathy as opposed to sympathy. And while there's a fine line, I think that anyone is capable of being sympathetic. Not everyone is able to be empathetic. And that's okay that maybe Logan can't understand what you and I went through having kids up in Lebanon or down in Gaza, right? But you're able to reach out and give that sympathy. And that's a huge deal. That not everyone who has been able to do so has done so. Scott, in some of the responses that you've received, I saw quite a few people who said, you know what, that it's created a rift within their family and friends for people who have not reached out. It's not an unheard of situation. Unfortunately, way, way, way too common.
Yeah, what you're referring to, Shira, is on the Facebook group for this podcast, the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group on Facebook. I put up a question just saying, do American Jews care enough about Israel? And it was obviously a loaded statement that was very inexact, partially by design, partially to be a prompt. And people immediately wrote in. Some said this question is unfair, which I acknowledge. Other people said yes, and some people said no. In fact, given that you mentioned that, Shira, let me just mention a couple responses which I think are important. Regarding what you just said now, one person wrote to me, some of these were written publicly and some were written privately, by the way. One person wrote, I find it extremely difficult to connect with my dear friends and relatives abroad. My lived experience in Israel is so different from theirs. I've actually stopped contacting most. I just can't bear the divergence. And I think that's what you're referring to right now. And a lot of people I know have felt that, and there's that sense of distance that's moving over there. Rabbi Steinmetz, you wanted to add something to that?
I mean, I really have two very different points I want to make right now. I mean, first, about that sense of divergence, and really to talk a little bit about the obligations of people outside of Israel. Well, before I even do that, I want to just sort of put a bracket around it. I mean, we're really talking about very specific communities. You're talking about a very idealistic American Jews. Like, I mean, I've been to Israel also, with 3 different missions and 2 other separate trips of my own and going. I mean, I remember going at the end of October in 2023, and there were no cars on the road. It was like COVID. I'm sure you remember that. And it being ghastly and like really being shocked by what I saw, and coming back and telling everyone in the shul, like, this is worse than we can imagine. So, I mean, I think we're talking about groups that are very, very idealistic. And when my last mission to Israel, which was during Thanksgiving break, we had 3 synagogue weddings in Israel that week. It happened to just overlap with my mission. And in other words, people from the synagogue who decided to make their weddings in Israel. And we had 2 sort of quasi bar mitzvah, pre-bar mitzvah celebrations. So, like, I mean, we're like in a very idealistic group, but I mean, we do need to put a bracket around it and just notice that there are a lot of Americans, even those who really love Israel, who may not be in communities where there's even any sort of activity on behalf of Israel. Like, there's this American Jewish Committee survey, which, at least by their view, American Jews are very supportive of Israel. And yet, even so, when they asked the question, what have you done? 52% said nothing. Like, in other words, they don't even know what to do. So I think we need to sort of bracket and recognize what we're talking about. But two comments. The first comment about the divergent experiences, which is something I would say American Jews and Israeli Jews have to help us with this. We need, American rabbis need to talk to their congregations. American leaders need to talk to their friends and say, you need to understand how difficult it is for them. And not to try to sugarcoat everything, and not to make every Israel story end up on a positive note. I mean, we always like to end on a positive note, but not to make it sound sugar-coated. I remember years ago, a Holocaust survivor that I knew in Montreal, that she came to me and she said that after the war, she didn't want to talk about her experiences because once she came to Montreal and she started to talk a bit about how difficult it was, a Canadian friend said to her, "Oh, we had a lot of difficulty too. We didn't have any butter." And she said, "How am I supposed to talk about the Holocaust when the other woman is saying that she didn't have butter?" Like she just stopped talking. Like she didn't want to talk, which is very similar to the experience you're talking about. And the second thing I do want to say is that American Jews need to take their responsibility for Israel. In other words, we need to see this as belonging to us. And I know there's all of these debates. Is Israel ours? Is it not ours? Do we have a say? Do we not have a say? I don't care about those debates. I do believe that we have a responsibility. And I remember and Scott knows my son, when my son enlisted in the IDF in Machal, and he was in Kfir, which is a combat unit. They said, "Are you going to let him go into a combat unit?" And I said, "How am I able to go to Israel and look at my friends in Israel who have to send their kids into combat units and say, no, I wouldn't let my own son do that." So there is this responsibility that if we believe that this is the Jewish state and that this is critical to our identity, then we need to take responsibility for it. So I did want to put that point in. And I think that it's very important for us to emphasize this. As much as I find it, and I still want to sort of, I don't know if we've defined it, as to why there is this feeling that Israeli Jews feel abandoned by American Jews. As much as I'd like to sort of get at that, I really think American Jews need to understand what's happening in Israel and need to recognize that they have a responsibility for the state of Israel, because without it, we would be nothing.
I'd like to add one point to what you just said, because in terms of the responsibility that American Jews have towards Israel, people have asked me numerous times, just anecdotally, what do you think? Do you think that American kids should go to the army? For example, I've been very vocal about my displeasure with the Haredi community not serving in the army. So people have said to me, do you feel the same way about American Jewish kids? And the answer is no, I don't. And the reason I feel it's different is, although I do feel and agree with you that we are one community, we should not look at ourselves as completely divergent and separate, there's a very, very big difference between someone who grows up outside of Israel, doesn't know the language, doesn't know the culture, never had it in his culture that he's supposed to go to the army, versus, for example, someone like my son Yaki, who grew up, he's 20 years old, he always knew he was going to go to the army. He speaks the language. He's part of the culture. So to me, American Jews who join the army, and I've said this many times, so this is not a type of flattery for you, Rabbi Steinmetz, but I've said this, they are at the very top of the pyramid of merit of the Jewish people. Those people who live outside of Israel, and
My
nevertheless,
son, not me, just to make that point.
My second part of that is their parents, who obviously raised them in a very special way. So the people who join the army, even though they didn't have to, who live outside of Israel, and their families, to me, stand at the very top of that pyramid of merit. You deserve a lot of credit for that, and so does everybody whose kids and the kids themselves join the army when they didn't have to do so. So I just want to make that, to me, that's a very important point to make clear. Logan, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity in this time. Could we be doing more? We could always do more, right? We could always do more. But I think there's also a moment to talk about why American Jews have some of this disconnect, right? How we culturally, religiously have created or helped with this divide. First of all, it is running away from the word Zionism. Right? It is making Judaism solely a faith and not a tribe of people, and talking about our connection and our history beyond how we might practice. It's the fact that, and by the way, it's one of my biggest concerns as I try to learn Hebrew as a middle-aged person and not biblical Hebrew with vowels. We don't teach the cultural connections. We don't. And if we could be doing a better job here in the States, making the connection between the diaspora and Israel a lot smoother, right? To get back to this we are all one family moment. And I want to remind my Israeli friends often, if and when they feel like diaspora Jews aren't doing enough, is we've done that because we've made Israel super successful, and we've made American Jews super successful, that we thought we were separate. right? Only to find out in the worst of times that we're not. So we have a long way to go, but I do think at everyone's heart, we understand who we are now in ways that we didn't before. And now we just have to find smart, strategic, meaningful ways to bridge that gap again.
Well, I want to ask if that's really true, because what you're saying, a lot of people have said, certainly applies to the more engaged Jews, perhaps those in the more religious communities or those who are more actively involved in Israel advocacy in the Jewish community. But some have said to me that the phenomenon that I've described really is a difference between what happened a year ago when the larger Jewish community, to a certain degree, all came together, including those people who never really thought about Israel before. And as time went on and there was war fatigue and life fatigue and other things took precedence, and the American elections took place, and that's another thing they have to think about. And of course, you mentioned, Logan, before, the media, Israel became the bad guy. We can talk about why that happened, but whatever. Israel became the bad guy, and associating with Israel was no longer, I mean, it happened pretty quickly, but was no longer such an easy thing to do. Those people who had less natural dedication, obviously there were some who stayed very strongly with Israel, which is a wonderful thing, but a lot of the others, maybe they didn't change emotionally, but they stopped being so vocal about it, or maybe started having self-doubts. I'm curious if you agree with that, which part of the problem might be not that American Jews care less, but fewer American Jews are willing to speak up as time went on because they never were that engaged. They were temporarily engaged, and then they went back to their status quo.
I am one of those people, I have to say, that I felt, and I think you know this, that for years I have been screaming into the void, begging people to pay attention to what has been happening all over, right? That this was never about Israel, this was never about Zionism, this was about Jewry. And for many years, I've been pat on the head like Chicken Little, like, oh, the sky is falling, you're so cute, you know, thanks, crazy girl. You know, only to wake up, obviously, on October 8th, and all of these people are now like, whoa, you know, you saw this. And I saw it maybe because I grew up in a home where my grandfather was an American Zionist leader, where I never got too comfortable. We knew our history. I think about it today. I think my sister and I saw and read every single Holocaust-related book and film by the time we were in 4th grade. Right? Everything that could possibly been in that canon we had experienced. And I do think that there are a lot of people who deeply care and who have paid attention. Yes, I think there is some giving fatigue for sure. And I think there is some social media speaking up, feeling beaten down fatigue, which is real for a lot of people. You have to have a very, very thick skin. And I like to tell people that I have a very good dermatologist because you can't tell just how thick my skin is. But I do think that if push came to shove, people would speak up again. People would speak up. People care. You know, they might not always be the one right in the front who's the lightning rod, but they are going to do the work behind the scenes. And I do think that this fight has proven that we need all kinds of fighters. Some of us are going to be the ones right in front taking the hit, and others are going to compile evidence and data and work from the back. And I think that's okay. And so maybe we can't expect the same thing from anyone as long as their heart and their mission is, we are one family, we are global Jewry, and we support Israel.
Then let me take that further. If we look at ourselves as one family, one of the questions that some people asked on that Facebook group, and also which I've heard elsewhere, is, maybe I'm asking the wrong question. By asking whether American Jews care enough about Israel, what about Israeli Jews caring enough about Jews outside of Israel? Is that a problem too? And some people to whom I've mentioned that question have laughed at me and said that's ridiculous. I'm talking about people in Israel and outside of Israel. And other people say, no, that is the right question to ask. So I'll start with you, Shira. Do you think that that's an issue also? Is it possible that American Jews need more support from us to say, hey, you're going through anti-Semitism, as Logan describes. We're one people. Things are crazy there. She's more scared on the subway than we are in Beit Shemesh. So maybe we're not reaching out to people like that while we're complaining that they're not reaching out to us, and maybe it's even worse in some ways for them. Now, again, caveat, their kids aren't serving in war for the most part. So that is different. But on a day-to-day basis, is it possible that we need to reciprocate in the other direction?
So I have to tell you, again, having so many different connections in different parts of the world, I really do try to reach out personally. I don't know that most people do, but I know that as soon as something happens, sometimes I know what happens sooner than the person who lives in that country. And I personally do try to reach out. I think it's as important. I don't think a relationship is definitely not one directional. Okay. And it's not because if we expect the help from the US, therefore we need to give back. It's just interpersonal relationships, I think, are very important. Doesn't matter, Jews, non-Jews. But again, it goes back to what I said before, that not everyone feels comfortable doing that. I can tell you that the first 2 weeks of the war, when there were things blowing up, so to speak, in the US, I was more concerned about my friends and my family over there than what they should have been over here. Because over here, yes, you're in a bubble. Yes, you feel, yes, there's certain things that were going on, but we knew exactly where it was. We wasn't, as you said, Logan, we don't know where it's going to be coming from when it's not in Israel. When you're in Israel, you feel more secure. You know where about your danger is coming from. And I think that really is a very important lesson for everyone to really to know and to have, that the love should really be coming in both directions.
It's funny you say that, because about 2 weeks after October 7th, I was interviewed by somebody I know on a Catholic podcast. It was someone who came to our house for a Friday night dinner, and she asked about the danger in Israel. And I said, well, obviously for us in Ramat Beit Shemesh, that's not a big deal because Gaza is an hour away. And for someone in the United States, an hour away, it's like that's very, very close. The front is an hour away is not called far away, but that's a matter of experience. Rabbi Steinmetz?
No, I wanted to say to what Shira said is that, to go to the positive side for a moment, when Israeli groups would come here to America, and Gesher would very often take me to come in and meet with them, and all different types of groups of high-tech executives and heads of mechinot, and invariably they would ask, how are you dealing with anti-Semitism? It was like a very serious, worried question. And I would tell them the old tale that was told about the place where the Beit HaMikdash was built. The field where the Beit HaMikdash was built was that it was originally owned by two brothers who inherited it from their father. One had a large family and one didn't have a family. And in the middle of the night, the one without the family would run and take some of his wheat and throw it into the field of the brother with the family, saying to himself, my brother has such a large family, I don't really need to support anyone. Let me give him some of his wheat. And the brother with the large family would come out and throw some wheat into the field of the other brother and say, well, I have a large family. When I get older, they'll take care of me. My brother needs to save for the future. Let me give him some of my wheat. And then one night they run out at the same time, and they run into each other. And at that moment, they notice what's happening. And God calls out and says, this is where I want the Beit HaMikdash to be built. And I told Israeli groups, I said, you come here and you worry about anti-Semitism. And I say, we're worried about the future of the state of Israel. And as long as we're worried about each other, thank God, the situation is very good. And it's much like that story that maybe God is calling out and saying, there's a good future for all of you.
I have to say, I feel like every Israeli that I have encountered in the last year plus, right? The last 2 years has said, I feel like we've dropped the ball here on being aware and concerned about what you're dealing with in the diaspora. And of course, we have the same conversation. Oh, what you're dealing with is so much more intense. But I think you're absolutely right, Rabbi, that it's equal, right? These are wars, and they're different wars, but they are both wars, right? And one ideally has a very clear end to it in Israel, but what is happening outside of Israel doesn't really have a clear end, right? Because we're starting to see how institutionalized and embedded Jew hatred has been in the system and emboldened, and we can debate whether or not there's actually a rise in it or we just didn't pay attention, right? And I have a lot of feelings about that. But I do think that absolutely, if we are indeed all one family, then we need to be concerned for each other. And we have different challenges, but in the end, they are global Jewry challenges, which means we're all impacted. And maybe we will all be better off if we start to see it that way. And again, treated each other like we are all one family, recognizing that we cannot always understand exactly the experience, as Shira said. But that doesn't mean we don't give care and heart and support in whatever form we need to give it in.
I'd like to bring this conversation to a close. We could go on for a very long time, but I'd like to ask each of you to give a recommendation. If you could say to both people in Israel and people in the United States or anywhere else in Chutz La'aretz, what we should do moving forward to try to bridge this gap. And as you said, Rabbi Steinmetz, it could be that I'm only reflecting a certain small subset of the way people feel here. But assuming that it's true, that I'm representing a general feeling of numerous people, that there feels like there's a lack of active support, that people aren't coming to Israel enough. People aren't advocating on behalf of Israel enough. There aren't the same rallies that we used to have, and the money has certainly dried up to a certain degree. It's not the same as it used to be. Assuming that there is some truth in that feeling on the part of Israelis. And similarly, the need to make sure that Israelis understand what's going on for people in Chutz La'aretz, to understand anti-Semitism certainly, but also to understand why engagement theoretically has gone down and why that's understandable, perhaps. I'd like to ask each of you to tell me how you'd like to move forward. What would you suggest moving forward at this point, Rabbi Steinmetz?
In terms of American Jews, visit Israel. There's no question about it. I took 3 missions, and full disclosure, I tried to organize a 4th and didn't get enough people, which was very disappointing to me. But what I told people on all 3 missions is I said, you will have succeeded the moment you get off the plane. When you enter Israel and you let the Israelis know that you're there, you will have succeeded in the mission. Everything else is fine, and we will do things that are meaningful. We will do things that are inspiring, but the most important thing is to be there. Showing up is 80% of life. You need to be there. And I that remains my advice. Obviously, as has been already pointed out, the fact that there's only one carrier that is flying directly from the United States to Israel makes it very difficult for people to get there, literally very difficult. Even if you're willing to pay, you can't get plane tickets when you want to get those plane tickets. But even so, we have to make every effort to go to Israel. Now, in terms of what I would recommend to Israelis, it's hard for me to imagine what that should be. I would say that they should get a sense of what American Jewish life is about, because I think most Israelis don't have a real sense of, I mean, you're American Israeli, so you do, or you're Anglo-Israeli, so you do. But for most Israelis, really don't have a sense of what the American Jewish community is about. They have some vague notions, but they don't understand within our own community. We're talking about the chacham, so to speak, at the Seder, the good son or the wise son. In our community, we have so many that either don't have any interest or even opposed, particularly amongst the young. And they really need to understand that our challenges are very large, even within our own community, and figuring out how to address Jewish continuity and how to get the message across about Israel to the younger generation. And so I would encourage Israelis, please, just get educated about what it means to be an American Jew.
Okay, thank you. Shira?
I really do think that for the most part, most Israelis do know what it's like to be an American Jew. I'm not talking about the stigmas. I think that if there are people who are involved, they are aware. There are people who do know what it's like. And when one's eyes want to be open, they can be. I think that there's one thing that Israelis differ from any other type of people from the world, from anywhere in the world, is that we're able to contain multiple types of feelings within ourselves at the same time, whereas I don't think that any other type of Jew, living anywhere else is really able to contain, which is why we're able to have a wedding and a funeral on the same day in the same yeshuv for, and realize that that's the way of life. Whereas maybe in the US, I'd say, well, no, I really need to choose to go to one or the other because I really can't handle it. I think that there's more awareness than what we are aware of. And I think that people just need to really just be awakened as to what the situation is.
Okay, thank you. Logan, let's conclude with you.
Without a doubt, people need to go to Israel. You need to have your feet on the ground. You need to talk to the people. You need to be there and experience Israel. There's no other solution in my book. And I would have said this way before October 7th, and I will continue to say it, in perpetuity. What I would hope for Israelis to do is to find partners, peers of American Jews, and teach us and show us a little bit of what it means to be a Sabra, what it means to have tachlis, what it means to be fearless. Because I think that's what a lot of what American Jews need. Not just education about our history and our peoplehood, but all of us are going to come up against some form of Jew hatred, right? Some might be a microaggression, some might be big, but we are all in this moment where we do not have the luxury of sticking our heads in the sand and pretending like it does not exist if we got away with doing that before. So I would love for Israelis to give us some of that fearlessness, because I think it would go a long way. And I think it would also help with that whole, we are brothers, we are sisters, we are family.
Shira, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to ask one more thing. And that is, when you say people come, you're talking about certain types of people are going to come. Logan, you've been 8 times already. Rabbi Steinmetz, you've been 4 times already. When we want to really be able to involve other Jews from the U.S., how are you reaching out to these people and saying, you know what, I want to involve those who haven't been involved yet? Saying and coming, I heard in one community, I just don't want to name names, that they adopted another community within Israel. Is that something that you've heard of is a done situation? That is a way to really bridge the gaps, be able to make those close relationships, to show that one is really supporting another. That's on the communal level, right? On the individual level, yes, Logan, I agree with you that to come and help and support and to do is a different way. But if we're really trying to reach other people, then there's a way that we need to try to think in a little bit of a different way than what we've been doing until now.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you all. This has been a really important conversation. And as I said at the beginning, my goal here was not to tell people the way it is, but rather to engender conversations, to allow people to talk a little bit more so that we don't have simple miscommunication through a lack of talking, through a lack of communication. Hopefully, if nothing else, this communication today demonstrated the possibility of people talking to each other rather than past each other. And I really appreciate all of you joining me today. Shira Katz Shaulov, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, Dr. Logan Levkoff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavyon Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood, in the heart of Beit Shemesh, about a 7-minute drive from where I live, actually. That puts you in a convenient and central location that has easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, but is also surrounded by trees and parks and overlooks the Elah Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings, but this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbi and rebbitzin. I'm pleased to announce that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be leading the spiritual development of this project when they make Aliyah to Eden with their 4 children and help to create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I was very impressed when I heard that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Krohn were going to be part of this project. My family and the Krohns go back decades, and the Krohn family are genuinely among the finest people I have met in my life. So for me, this is an exciting development. For more information about the Eden Project, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of The Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review The Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.